From Medskl.com, I'm Dr. Sanjay Sharma, and to If I Knew Then, a show that's based on a very simple premise that when everything is said and done, life comes down to a few key moments and decisions. On today's show, I'm thrilled to have James Clear. He is an entrepreneur, a photographer, and I guess as of yesterday, a New York Times best-selling author. Welcome to the show, James. It's really a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to be talking to you.
So typically where we start is just going back to the very beginning. Why don't you just walk us through where you grew up and maybe some of the important inspirations for you during those very formative years?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Hamilton, Ohio, just about 45 minutes north of Cincinnati.
For Medskl.com, I'm Dr. Sanjay Sharma, and welcome to If I Knew Then, a show that's based on a very simple premise that when everything is said and done, life comes down to a few key moments. And today I'm thrilled to have James Clear. He goes by a number of titles. He's a photographer and most recently a New York Times best-selling author. James, it's wonderful to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to be talking to you.
And so we're going to start off just at the very beginning. Why don't you walk me through, where you grew up, maybe some of the important influences that you look back on now and you say, these were critical for me to have gone through.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Hamilton, Ohio, just about 45 minutes north of Cincinnati. I spent a lot of time on my grandparents' farm. It was a lot of farmland around there. So I was outdoors a lot as a child. Really enjoyed like roaming the fields and doing kinds of like crazy things in the forest and stuff like that. But I think when I look back on my childhood, there are kind of two main areas that were formative for me. So the first was athletics. My dad played Major League Baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals. Wow. And was actually in the minor leagues for them with them for a little while. So of course, growing up, I wanted to be like him. So sports played a central role in my childhood as well. And then the other aspect was I always enjoyed learning. Some kids don't like school or don't enjoy school, but I loved it. And so I kind of had these like two areas where I was either always hanging out with people who were like more athletic than me, or I was always hanging out with people who were like smarter than I was. And so we did a bunch of really nerdy things early on. Like when I was in 5th grade, we started this robotics club, which was basically just like we would play with Legos and then program like Lego conveyor belts and things to run, forward and backwards and whatever. But I look back on that time now and, I'm a technology entrepreneur and have spent a lot of time working on the web. And, a lot of the things that I do with computers were triggered or formed in some of those early years. Like that interest was sparked just by being around other kids that were, like we were building our own computers and stuff when I was in 8th grade, and I didn't really know how to do any of that, but my friends did. And so that was a kind of a formative experience. And eventually that led me down like a pretty scientific path. I actually was planning on going to medical school for quite a while. I was hard sciences in undergrad, biology, mostly chemistry and physics. My technical major was called biomechanics, but and then a little bit of biology and anatomy as well. And then afterward, I went to graduate school. I went to business school, and I was studying in the Center for Entrepreneurship, and that was where I started to get the itch to do my own thing. So I got exposed to that, saw these people starting their own businesses, and so after I graduated, I launched my own company, and I realized pretty quickly that I had no idea what I was doing. And so I floundered around for about 2 years. And eventually that led to the path that I'm on now, because I realized I don't know how to market anything. Like I'll make a product and I don't know why someone would buy it. I don't know why someone would sign up to an email list or whatever. And so I started studying consumer psychology to figure the business stuff out. And that led me to behavioral psychology, habit formation, peak performance. And I started to connect these two worlds that I had as a child, like athletics and school and learning. And now I finally had a language for all the habits that I had built as an athlete. Like I had done them on the practice field or in the gym, but I didn't have a language for it at the time. And now I had a way to describe it and a way to understand the science and the research behind it And eventually I started writing about those things, and ultimately that's where we are now.
That's very interesting. It's, if I sort of think about it, I look at your Venn diagram as an outsider, you've got kind of the sports side, you had the technology layering on, starting in the robotics and moving into computers, and the habits probably in some ways started in the sports world, I would imagine, at a rudimentary level. And then one of the things that I love, I mean, I actually have written a book on evidence-based medicine as it pertains to kind of moving to value-based medicine. And so what I particularly love is when people, their book is really based on hard science and, a series of experiments. And so why don't you walk me through sort of the genesis of Atomic Habits and your, kind of the scientific or evidence-based approach to it?
Sure. So, everybody is building habits all the time, right? Like you can't be a human and not have habits. It's just this system that your brain is using to try to solve the recurring problems that you face. And I think that that's one way to define what a habit is. It's the reliable solutions that you come up with to recurring problems that you face in your environment. So, if you put your shoe on and your shoe is untied, then in a sense, that's a problem that your brain has to solve. And every day you look at that and at first it's effortful and takes a little bit of time to tie the shoe and you have to practice it. But then if you do it 500 or 1,000 times, your brain has more or less automated the process of tying a shoe, the solution to the problem of having an untied shoe. And so whenever that situation repeats itself and recurs, your brain can perform more or less on autopilot. So we all have these things, but just because we've all experienced it, doesn't mean that we have like a good language for describing it. And so I think that my job is to look at the scientific evidence, and I like to describe myself as being idea agnostic. And what I mean by that is I don't really care where a good idea comes from. Like I'm not going to confine myself just to neuroscience, for example, or just to biology or just to psychology. So as long as an idea is good and useful, I'm open to using it. And I think, of course, in school, we divide ideas into disciplines because we have to teach it well. But in the real world, like ideas are liquid and fluid. There is no difference between biology and neuroscience and philosophy and psychology. Like they all bleed into each other and interact in certain ways. So I try to do that in my writing. But of course, it's very hard. Nobody can be an expert in all of those different areas. And so what I do is I essentially have people that I trust that are more or less curators for the scientific consensus in that particular field. And then I utilize their curation as a starting point for my investigation into how does biology influence habits? How does philosophy influence habits, and so on. So that's kind of how I try to approach having a very broad net of scientific and evidence-based ideas and applying them to the one particular thing that I happen to write about or be interested in. Now, once you do that, then I think my job becomes translating the scientific evidence into something that's practical and actionable and useful. Like I love hearing about scientific ideas or theory just because they're interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm really into space, for example, so we can talk about, space all day long, and I'll find it really fascinating. But what I really like is when a scientific idea can be applied to daily life. And so that I think is my job as a writer, is not really to come up with the ideas, but to curate the best ones and then translate them into stories or ideas or techniques that are actionable in daily life.
Got it. Now I'm always interested in, as a father, knowing when the best time to start habits is. And so, and I'm also going to, mention, something called amblyopia in the eye world. So, we see children on a regular basis who, can't focus light on the retina, for instance. And there's a very critical period that if we get them, and start patching their good eye and forcing their bad eye to work, we can essentially get the right neuronal pathways to form between the eye and the brain. But that critical period is, let's say it tails off at 12, 13, 14 years. Now, I'm just interested in habits. Is there an ideal time to establish a habit, or are we plastic enough, as 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds to actually change what we do?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, wasn't there a famous study done on eye formation in cats in like the 60s or something? Wasn't there one like that?
There was.
They would block the...
Exactly, yes.
I think, yeah, anyway, I remember hearing about that. It's very interesting, this idea of like a critical period where if you don't hit it just right, then the formation of the, the nervous system and so on isn't exactly the way that it should be. But, okay, so one way that I think you can answer this question is to say, do people change their behavior over time? And almost everybody, I think we would say, yes, the person that I am today is different than the person that I was 10 years ago. And in all likelihood, the person I'll be 10 years from now is going to be different than who I am today. And that's true as we continue through life. Like people develop different patterns of behavior. What the average 75-year-old does is probably a little different than what the average 65-year-old does, and much different maybe than what the average 25-year-old does. So my point here is that your habits and behaviors are changing anyway already. So from a high level, that gives us an answer, which is yes, we are plastic, or that we will change over time. The next important question, though, is can you design that in any way, right? So like, yes, we're going to be changing anyway. So can we take control of the process? And I think you can, but maybe not in the way that like people commonly talk about it. So the typical conversation about how to change your habits and behavior as you go through life is you need more perseverance and willpower. You need to try harder, grit, like it's mostly about hustle and hard work and willpower and so on. But if you look at what actually causes people to change their behavior, it's often very different than that. It's not that those qualities aren't important. They can be useful on a short-term basis. But if you look at what changes people's behavior over the long run, it's often other factors. And two of the biggest ones are the physical environment and the social environment. And so when the physical environment changes, for example, if you walk into a store and the shelves are arranged in a different way, people will buy different products just because of how the products are arranged, not necessarily because they wanted it in some deep way, or they had like the willpower to buy Coke versus orange juice or something like that. But companies, of course, are well aware of this, right? Like most Coca-Cola sales, or maybe perhaps not the total majority, but the largest area that Coca-Cola sales are accounted for is on these end of aisle racks. So they're called end caps, so the units that are on the end of the aisles in grocery stores and so on. And one of the reasons is simply because those are very visible locations. You see them, once you get out of every single aisle, and not just like, 3/4 of the way down aisle 11 or something like that. And that leads to more purchases. And there's a study that I mentioned in chapter 7 of the book, chapter 6 of the book, about a hospital cafeteria. It's Massachusetts General Hospital. The researchers came in and redesigned the hospital cafeteria so that water was available in every fridge and next to the cashier, rather than just in like 1 or 2 in the cafeteria, 1 or 2 refrigerators. And the result of that was over the next like 3 months, water sales increased 25% and Coca-Cola sales decreased 11%. And what's funny about that is they didn't talk to anyone. And if you went up to those people and asked, why are you drinking a Coke? They would say, oh, well, I wanted it. I chose it. But the truth is, at least 10% of those people chose Coke just because it was more prevalent, or when the environment changed, chose water because it was more prevalent. So I think one answer to how to change your behavior is to adjust your physical environment. And we can talk more about how to do that. And then the second major factor is the social environment. So many of our behaviors are socially reinforced. And this is obvious to anyone as soon as you start to state it. But like, think about some of our most common habits, like walking onto an elevator and you turn around to face the front. Or when you have a job interview, you wear a suit and a tie or a dress or something nice. Now, there's no reason that it has to be that way, right? Like you could face the back of the elevator, you could wear a bathing suit to a job interview, but you don't do that because it violates the expectations of that particular group or that particular tribe, that context. And so all of us are part of multiple tribes. Some of them are large, like what it means to be American or what it means to be Canadian or French or whatever. And some of them are small, like what it means to be a member of your medical school class, or what it means to be a member of your local CrossFit gym or a neighbor on your street. But all of those tribes, all of those social groups have a set of shared expectations. So for example, the expectation of being a neighbor on your street might be, we put our trash out on Wednesday nights. And if you don't do that, then it violates the shared expectations of the group and you stand out, you stick out. In some cases, if the violation is strong enough, you're cast out. And this is one of the lessons about why people stick to certain behaviors and why habits change over time. When habits go with the grain of the shared expectations of the group, they're very attractive and we want to stick with them. When they go against the grain of your tribe, they're very unattractive. And so one of the most effective ways to get people to change their behavior in the long run is to join a group where the desired behavior is the normal behavior. So just to quick summarize, if you can change the physical environment and you can enter a social environment where your desired behavior is the normal behavior, you've got two really good levers for designing your habits and not just letting that change happen to you over the span of life.
And I'm assuming the like something like Alcoholics Anonymous, or it really leverages the second part of that concept, right?
Right. So in a sense, when you ask people to change their habits, what you're really asking them to do is change their tribe. And so you'll see that often when people need to change their behavior, they have to join a new group. And this is, so going to Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, you can imagine how important it is to have a group like that versus saying, you know what, I'm just not going to go to the bar and I'll go home instead. And the reason I say that is because people can want to change, they can have a desire for change. But if the option is, I could either have the habits I don't want to have, but get to stay with my friends, but get to belong with the tribe, or I could have the habits I want to have, but I have to be alone, then we would often rather choose to be wrong with the crowd than right by ourselves.
Right.
And this is just evolutionary programming, right? I mean, our ancestors, the ancestors who survived, were very good at living in tribes and at surviving and accounting for the needs and wants of those around them. And that was why we have been selected to have this strong desire to belong. And the ancestors who didn't have a strong desire to belong, who put their own needs first, or who cast out from the group, were less likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so all humans are wired with this urge to belong. And it creates this conflict when we have a personal goal, an individual habit that we want to achieve, but it presses up or conflicts against the group desire to belong. And that's why it's really really important to have that social alignment, so that both of those desires are working in your favor rather than competing with each other.
Let's go to a very specific problem that we're going to try to solve with habits. So,
Sure.
Certainly diabetes is endemic at this point in time. I deal with a lot of patients with diabetes-related eye disease, and a number of them struggle, with weight loss or just different eating habits. Any suggestions how atomic habits, can maybe change a diabetic's life?
Sure. So first, let me define what I mean by an atomic habit, and then apply it to this context. So I chose the phrase atomic habits for three reasons. So the first reason is that the word atomic can mean tiny or small, like an atom. And that is part of my philosophy, that habits should be small and easy to do. The second meaning is that the word atomic can mean the fundamental unit in a larger system. So atoms build into molecules, molecules build into compounds, and so on. And similarly, I think we could say that habits are sort of like the atoms of our lives. They're these little fundamental routines or patterns. And when you layer them all together, like atoms in a molecule, you end up with the larger pattern of your daily routine, or what your normal day looks like. And then the third reason is that the word atomic can also mean the source of immense energy or power. And I think that if you combine all three of those meanings, you understand the narrative arc of the book, which is if you make small and easy changes and you layer them on top of each other like units in a fundamental system to create this larger daily routine, then you can end up with powerful or remarkable results in the long run.
I love it. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. So that's the core idea. And if we're going to apply that to diabetes, then I think I'll just suggest two things right here. Of course, there are many other ideas in the book that could also apply. But the first one is to use what I call the 2-minute rule. So often when we think about making a change, we're focused on the result that we want to achieve. And in this case, the result might be, reducing your risk of diabetes, or maybe even getting rid of it entirely, reversing that kind of chronic disease. In other cases, it's things like, I want to earn 6 figures this year. I want to lose 20 pounds on the scale, or, whatever the outcome is. I want to become a person who meditates 15 minutes a day. And the problem with focusing on those results and outcomes first is not that they're unuseful, but what they're useful for is a sense of clarity and setting a sense of direction. But when you make it all about the results, especially if it's some kind of long-term thing like reversing a chronic disease, we instead need to scale it down to something that we can focus on, like a small win. a daily behavior. So in this case, I recommend the 2-minute rule, which essentially says, take whatever habit you're trying to build and scale it down to just the first 2 minutes. So for example, we know that eating healthy and exercise are going to be 2 big parts of this plan to help reverse diabetes. Well, I had one reader who ended up losing over 100 pounds. And one of the things that he did was he went to the gym, but he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So it sounds kind of crazy in the beginning.
Yeah.
He woke up each day, got in the car, drove to the gym, got out, did like half an exercise, got back in the car, drove home. And if we're results focused, this sounds like a total waste of time, right? Because it's like going to the gym for 5 minutes is not going to help you get in shape. It's not going to reverse chronic disease. Like, why are we bothering? But what you realize is that he was mastering the art of showing up. And this is a key lesson about all habits. A habit must be established before it can be improved. And so often we're focused on achieving a particular result, and we don't become the type of person who shows up every day. And so in his case, he turned around like 6 weeks later and he was like, I'm coming here every day. I kind of feel like staying a little bit longer. And it might sound crazy to a physician, for example, to recommend go to the gym for 2 minutes a day. And it sounds silly to the patient to receive that. But really what we're looking to do is to develop the type of identity of, let me become the person who doesn't miss workouts. Let me become the type of person who goes to the gym every day and shows up there. Because once I'm that kind of person, then I have a lot of options. Then you can scale it out from that. So often we're like, in the beginning, we're worried about what is the perfect diet plan? What is the best business idea? What's the ideal workout program? And we're so focused on that picture perfect end result that we never figure out how to master showing up in the first place. So that would be one area that I would start. And I guess I'll pause there. I have another option as well that we could have.
Yeah, but it's interesting just in terms of business. I mean, that's also another interesting philosophy is you're right. You're never going to get the perfect business model or plan or whatever. And so much of life is, is just showing up and trying to immerse yourself in the reality and then reacting to what's thrown at you, right?
I like to, a lot of life, if we're being honest, a lot of life is randomness and luck and uncertainty, and you don't have control over all those things. But what you do have control over is you can kind of increase your surface area for luck. You can increase your surface area for good things happening to you. And so I like to think about that. Like, what are the ways that I can just focus on showing up that increases my surface area for something good happening? So for example, with writing. So when I launched Medskl.com, I wrote 2 articles a week. I wrote an article every Monday and Thursday. And I did that for about 3 years. And that was a lot of surface area. And no one article, I didn't know if any one article was going to go viral. Couldn't predict that. But I know that if I showed up and I had 200 or so, well, then maybe something good could happen. And there's been, some weird chains of events like that. One of the articles I wrote about 4 years ago, the New York Times picked it up earlier this year. And then a producer from CBS this morning saw it on the New York Times. And then they asked me to come on TV and whatever. And my point is just that, like, I never could have predicted that. That was just totally random. But it happened because I put out a lot of these, opportunities for something good to happen. And in a sense, going to the gym is kind of like that too. Like, imagine if you only worked out on days when you felt like you could hit a PR. Or set some kind of personal record. There's no way to actually, it doesn't work that way. You couldn't just go to the gym like once a month and then lift the heaviest weight you've ever lifted. You have to actually show up every day or 3 days a week or whatever to increase the surface area for having a day where you show up and you feel really fresh and good and hit a nice number. So anyway, that's the first lesson is scale it down, master the art of showing up, and then optimize later. The second core lesson that I think could apply to any diabetes patient is this idea of building what I call identity-based habits rather than outcome-based habits. So with outcome-based habits, and this is somewhat similar to the philosophy we were talking about earlier, where you put the result first. People say things like, well, I know I want to be skinny, and if I follow this diet plan, then I'll be skinny. And that's like more or less all the thought that they put into it. And then whatever kind of person they are, whatever type of values evolve out of that or type of identity comes out of that, it's just they kind of let it happen naturally. I think it'd be better if we inverted that process. So let's start by saying, who is the type of person that could achieve the result that I'm looking to achieve? What kind of identity would I need to have to be that kind of person? Then build habits that foster that identity, and whatever results come, you let them come naturally. So for example, let's say that weight loss is a goal. well, who is the type of person that could lose 30 pounds? Maybe it's the type of person that doesn't miss workouts. Now let me focus my habits on becoming the type of person who doesn't miss workouts, and then let the results come naturally. And what happens if you do that, if you put the identity first, is that it shifts the scope of the habits that you're trying to build. Because rather than becoming like really ambitious and trying to bite off more than you can chew, and forcing yourself to achieve a particular result on a given time frame, you're more focused on like casting a vote for being that type of person. So in a sense, like every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become. So it's kind of like your habits are how you embody a particular identity, right? Like,
yeah,
every morning that you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who is clean and organized. Or whenever you write one sentence, you embody the identity of someone who is a writer. Or in the example of my reader who went to the gym for 5 minutes a day, if you go to the gym for 5 minutes, you embody the identity of someone who is fit and doesn't miss workouts. And it's not that any single instance will transform your beliefs or develop self-confidence or change the way you look at yourself. But if you cast enough votes, then it's kind of like you accumulate this little pile of evidence of, hey, this is who I am. And eventually the scale tips in your favor, and you actually start to view things in that way. And once that happens, it really changes the way that you interact with your daily experiences. So for example, imagine two people see a pack of cigarettes. The first person says, oh, no, thanks. Like, I don't want a cigarette. I'm trying to quit. The second person says, oh, no, thanks. I'm not a smoker. Now, technically, they both have turned down the cigarettes, the same action, but the way that they view that experience is totally different. The one person still identifies as a smoker who's trying to quit, and the other person identifies as a non-smoker. And once you cross that threshold and adopted a new identity, you're not even really pursuing behavior change anymore. You're just acting in alignment with the type of person you already believe that you are. And so I think ultimately where we're trying to get people, whether they're diabetic or a smoker or looking to make any other type of behavior change, true behavior change is identity change. It's like a shift in how you see things, because now suddenly you see a donut and it's not attractive in the same way, because you're like, oh, I don't eat sugar. I'm the type of person who doesn't eat sugar, right? Or something like that. Once you have that identity shift, it becomes easier to do all the right things. And I think the only way to get that is by casting enough small votes for being that type of person.
That's very interesting. Along those lines, that kind of identity shift, do you see mentorship as playing a role in that, or maybe supercharging that identity shift? And the reason I bring that up is, in my own life, I've been, very lucky to have very powerful mentors at an early age and stage in my career, and that I think that's been incredibly influential. And it's almost like you see and start to model, what some of these other people have done before you. So, do you think that that's an important part of your model?
Yeah, certainly. So I think it influences in two ways. The first way is similar to what we've already referenced about how habits are socially reinforced. And one of the ways that happens is not just with the expectations of the tribe, which we talked about a few minutes ago, but also humans are master imitators. And this is obvious to anybody who has a young child, right? Like your 3-year-old will do exactly what the parent does, even if you don't want them to. But what happens is that as children age, they imitate their parents less and less, and they imitate their peers more and more. And so this is why it's important for parents to place their children in a social context where they're surrounded by the kind of peers that you want them to be surrounded by. Because if their friends are doing it, it's going to be attractive for the child to do it as well. Now, as we continue to age through life, we not only start to replicate our peers. For example, you may see what another doctor is doing to get the attention of the attending, or to get the attention of, whoever their particular boss is. And you see, oh, my coworker is doing this and that's earning them praise. So then maybe I'll replicate that habit as well. So we still do that when we're adults. But what we also do is we look to positions of authority to learn how to act. It's like, how did my boss get into that position? Or how did the leader of this company start the business? Maybe I should do something like that. How did the general run the battalion? Maybe I should treat my troops that way. And so what we do is we imitate 3 groups. And I refer to them in the book as the close, the many, and the powerful. So we imitate the people who are close to us. You often see if your parents eat a particular way, you do as well. or if your peers eat a particular way, you do as well. So you imitate those around you. You imitate the many. Often our behaviors replicate what the masses do. There's kind of like this wisdom of the crowd. This is why we look at reviews on Amazon. What's everybody saying about this book? Or reviews on Yelp. Should I go to this restaurant or not? So we imitate social proof. And then the third group is we imitate status. We imitate authority. And the powerful among us, our bosses, our leaders, we replicate them because we want to achieve power ourselves. We want to rise the ranks. We want to embrace the same kind of, or develop the same kind of respect and status that they have. And so mentors can be very useful in that way, because if we idolize our mentor, even if it's not to an unhealthy degree, even if we just simply respect them, then we want to replicate the kind of things that they do. So that's the first way that mentors influence our habits, is through imitation. The second way is that there's kind of a downside to building good habits, which is that as you build habits, you become more mindless. You start overlooking your mistakes, because once you can do it good enough on autopilot, you stop thinking about how to do it better, right? You like, oh, I can, for example, I just mentioned tying my shoe at the beginning of this. Well, I don't really think about how well I tied the knot, like maybe it's kind of loose, maybe it's not, maybe it's a little lopsided, but who cares, because it was good enough to tie the shoe. And that happens a lot with habits. As we form them, we stop looking for ways to improve, and we start overlooking these little mistakes. Well, this is one of the key roles of mentors and coaches. Mentors and coaches can stay aware of your mistakes when you start to do things mindlessly. And one of my favorite stories of this actually comes from the field of medicine. Atul Gawande, the famous surgeon from Boston, he hired a recently retired surgeon to review his surgeries and go over the video with him and tell him, like, where was I making mistakes? Where could I improve? What did I not do properly in this particular instance? How would you have treated this circumstance? And I love that, because we often think about like athletes and musicians as having coaches, but we don't think about other fields. And the truth is, anybody can have a mentor or a coach that can help them stay aware of what they're doing and pull them back to center, or guide them toward the next level of performance when their practice is becoming a little mindless themselves.
That's very interesting. He's Atul's written some interesting books as well. Now, one thing that came to my mind was the sort of interplay between the right and left sides of the brain. And I know in your background, you've been a photographer, you've been quite artistic. Do you see habits, as, from someone in the creative space, is habit formation daunting? Does it in some way limit creativity? Has that issue ever come up?
So I get asked this quite a bit, actually. People are worried about this idea that, like, oh, will habits make me robotic? Or will I become, will I lose the opportunity for spontaneity or creative freedom? I don't want to pigeonhole myself into this like rigid lifestyle. And I think, after having thought about this for a little while, I think that it's actually a false dichotomy. And the reason I say that is that in many cases, habits do not restrict freedom, they actually create it. And so the way that I would like to think about this is that if you don't have your habits handled, if, for example, your financial habits are a mess, then you're always wondering where the next dollar will come from. Or if you don't have your health habits under control, you never feel like you have enough energy. Or if your learning habits are not up to speed, then you always feel like you're behind the curve. And so the people who don't have their habits dialed in always feel like they're one step behind. And the result of that is that you often don't have time for creativity and freedom and spontaneity, because you feel like, oh, I need to earn just a little bit more so I can pay the bills this month. I don't have time to go out with friends, or I don't have time to paint for an hour, or to just read something for fun. Or you get home from a long day of work and you don't have good health habits and exercise habits. And so you just feel totally exhausted, and you may have 3 hours, but having time is only valuable if you have the energy to capitalize on it. And so if you don't have good health habits or eating habits, then often you don't have the energy to capitalize on your free time. And so in a sense, I think it's actually the people who have these key areas of life dialed in and have their habits handled that are actually in the best position to capitalize on whatever free hour that they have. Now, of course, with anything, we could take this to an extreme, and every single minute of the day is organized and planned out. But I think that sometimes people ask me this in reference to my own habits because they think, oh, because I write about them, I must have this like really rigid schedule. But I think actually people would be surprised at how unstructured my day is compared to what maybe they would expect it to be. Really, what I try to do is master like what I call 5 or 6 maybe decisive moments throughout the day. And if I can master those decisive moments, then I get the stuff done that I need to get done. And really, my favorite thing is to have a blank calendar day because then I have a lot of space to work on the other things. But those decisive moments, just to pull on that thread for a second, there are often very little things, little habits that determine the next chunk of time. So, for example, there's a moment each morning where I'll go down and I'll open up my computer and either I'll open up Evernote and I'll work on the next article that I'm writing or a chapter in the book or whatever, or I'll go to ESPN and I'll like browse the latest sports news for an hour. And it's really what happens in that first hour is really about what happens in that first minute and whether which program I open up. And so I think that there are a lot of moments like that throughout the day where if you can just master that 1 or 2 minutes and send yourself down the right path, then you find that the next chunk of time is much more productive.
That's incredibly insightful. So staying along those lines, we actually have a question from one of the Toronto medical students who's asking how to eliminate procrastination when it comes time to kind of crunching down and studying. Any handy tips that we can offer them?
Yeah. So like everybody, I have dealt with plenty of procrastination in my own life. And what I've realized is that there are a couple things that help me get over this. And they're not what we the typical conversation is, which is like, just, suck it up, start working, stop procrastinating, try harder, whatever. You need to get motivated, blah, blah, blah. What I find is that we have now reached an interesting stage in society, modern society, where whenever we have like the slightest whim or urge or a little hint of boredom, we now have devices that allow us to act on that. So I'll give you 2 examples and tie them back to procrastination. So the first one is I've started this little routine where I'll leave my phone in another room until lunch each day. So I get about 3 to 4 hours where I don't have my phone around me at all in the morning. And I have a home office, so my phone is just up the stairs. It's like 45 seconds away in another room. Now, if I have it next to me, I'm like everybody else. I'll check my phone like every 3 minutes, I'll just be looking at it all the time. But if it's up the stairs in another room, I never go upstairs to get it. And so what's interesting to me is like, well, did I want it or not? Because in a sense, I did want it. I checked it 100 times when it was right next to me. But when it was 45 seconds away, I never wanted it enough to put in the work for a minute to go get it. And I think that a lot of our procrastinations are like that, where they're really what's happening is we get like a little wave of boredom. And if you could just sit with it for 10 or 15 seconds, it would pass and you would return to the thing that you're doing. But because we have smartphones and YouTube and Twitter and all these options that we can open up a new tab or pull out our phone, and it only takes 3 seconds, well, now we act on that urge. And so it's kind of like you need to remove the mental candy from your environment. And when you do that, it becomes much easier to like metaphorically eat the healthy stuff and stay focused on the tasks that you want to do. And the other thing that I realized by this was that when I left my phone in another room, it wasn't that I didn't want to write the article. I actually did, because a lot of times when we procrastinate, we think, oh, I must not want to do the thing, right? I must not want to study. I must not want to write. I must not want to, work on whatever the important task is. But actually, I did want to. I just needed to give myself an opportunity to let those little waves of boredom pass, and then I would get back into the work. I just needed to like sit with it for a minute, and then I'd start again. Mm-hmm. And so if you can design an environment where you can do that, and there are a couple ways you can. So the first is leaving your phone out of the room. The second, there are a variety of online tools, digital tools that will help you with this. So one is called, these are both Chrome extensions. So they're little extensions you add to your Chrome browser online. But one is called Distraction-Free YouTube, and it allows you to watch a YouTube video, but it blocks all the videos in the sidebar, so that you can't see any of the suggested things and like get in the spiral where you're just clicking on other stuff.
Wow, good.
The second one is called Newsfeed Eradicator for Facebook, and you add that extension, and you can log into Facebook, and you could go to your friend's profile, or you could post something if you wanted, but it blocks the whole newsfeed, so you don't see any articles or links or any updates or anything else. So those two are effective. if you really want to be extreme with it, you can do something similar to what I did for the last year. I've spent 3 years writing this book, and I got about a year into writing Atomic Habits, and I realized I'm going to need to be more focused than I am if I want to get this thing done.
Sure.
And so I had my assistant every Monday. She would change the passwords to Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I would be locked out all week.
I
I'd
love
work,
it. I love it.
give them to me on Friday. I'd go log in over the weekend, and then on Monday we'd do it all over again.
Wow.
And so my point is that you can use some of these strategies to reshape your environment so that you're less exposed to the cues that cause procrastination, and force your hand a little bit so that you have to sit with that boredom for 10 or 15 or 30 seconds. And often that's enough to let it fade away, and you'll get back into the deeper work.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. We've had someone else write in, and the question is really about work-life balance. Do you have any way to kind of structure that formally through habits, or is it more of a time management thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. A tough question for doctors, because there's so much to do, or for medical students, there's so much to focus on. So part of that, the thing for me, so writing a book was also a very effortful period of my life. I don't know that I would say it's as effortful as being in medical school, but certainly at some points,
Sure.
it can be very, very intense. But the way that I've started to think about this, and I think probably many medical students feel similarly, where I'm very ambitious. And so it's hard for me to say no to things, because it's like, man, I have a lot of things I want to achieve. I have a lot of things I want to do. And so what's helped me get over that is starting to look at life as a series of seasons. And so the question that I continually ask myself is, what season am I in right now? And there's this theory, I wrote an article about it if you want to dig into it more, but it's called the 4 burners theory. And the basic idea is you can kind of divide your life into 4 quadrants, and like each one's a burner on a stove. So you have family, friends, health, and work. And the argument is, if you want to be really good at something, you can only have 3 of the burners running at once. And if you want to be great at something, you can only have 2. And so one way to handle this trade-off, it's really just about acknowledging the fact that life has trade-offs. Everybody has 24 hours. You have to make some decisions. And so the way that I deal with that 4 burners theory, or that the inherent trade-offs of life, is to say, well, what season am I in right now? So for me, my family burner is actually fairly low right now. I don't have any kids. I'm in a very career-focused time of my life. And so the work burner is really high. And then my kind of trade-off for that is I say, I'm going to keep my health burner high too. So I try to make sure that I get enough sleep and I work out. But the trade-off for that is I don't have a ton of time for family and friends right now. Whereas the season that I was in previously, when I was in college and graduate school and so on, that was actually really high on what I guess I would call work and friends. Like I had a really strong social life, and I was studying a lot, but I wasn't doing anything for career, and I wasn't doing much with family. And my health burner was maybe not as dialed in as it is now. So the point here is that nobody can tell you exactly what combination is best for you. You'll have to decide that. But all lives come with trade-offs. And one way for me to kind of get over that is to say, maybe it's not the season for this right now. Like, for example, I would love to learn a musical instrument. I don't know anything about music. I can't read music. I can't play an instrument. I think it'd be really cool to have that skill, but it's not the right season, because any hour that I give to that takes away from being a writer, building my business, focusing on my health, things like that. So, ultimately, this also comes down to the idea that it's easy to cut out bad wastes of time, right? Like when you're really busy, if you're a busy medical student, it's easier for them to all be like, yeah, of course, I shouldn't be watching YouTube for an hour. Like everybody knows that.
Yeah.
So that's obvious, but like may not be that helpful. But the thing that's hard is learning to cut out good uses of time that are not great uses of time. Warren Buffett has this, it's like 25-5 rule, where basically you write down on a sheet of paper the most 25 important things in your life right now, 25 important things you want to do. And then you prioritize them, you rank them 1 to 25. And once you get done with that, you circle the top 5. And typically when you ask somebody, all right, what's your strategy here? You've identified your top 5 most important things. And they say, okay, clearly I'm going to focus on that first. And then you say, well, what are you going to do about the other items on your list? And they're like, well, I'll work on those on nights and weekends, or I'll do that, in my downtime or when the other projects stall. And his response is, no, you've got it all wrong. Numbers 6 through 25 are your never do under any circumstance list. And the reason I like that is because the things that are most likely to distract you are things that you can have a good reason for doing, that you can rationalize. They're like, it's like item 7 or 8 on your priority list. And you're like, no, I should do this. Like, this is important to me. But because it's not a great use of time, it actually needs to be cut out. And that becomes increasingly important when time is really tight, like it is for a medical student or a surgeon or whatever.
Now, I love your story about you actually have a process for how to get to a New York Times bestseller. And I think I saw that earlier on today. So I'd love the students to hear that.
Well, I don't know that it's a dialed in process, and I can't say how it works for most people, but this is what it looked like for me. So November 12th, 2012, I wrote my first article on Medskl.com. I wrote 2 articles a week there for the next 3 years.
And so, sorry, can I just jump in for one sec? Did you know when you started Medskl.com, did you know, was the intent to write a book?
Well, by that time, yeah, I'll say sort of.
Okay.
So when I started writing, I actually did not know that so I mentioned earlier that I thought about going to medical school for a long time,
sure.
Or pursuing some kind of career in the sciences. I was, for most of my early career, like when I was in graduate school and, around that age where I had just finished undergrad, I was thinking about some kind of career in the sciences. Do I get a PhD or do I go to medical school? And I didn't know that I liked writing. I only took 1 English class when I was in college. If you talk to any of my professors in undergrad or any of my English teachers in high school, they probably all would have said, yeah, whatever, he's an average writer, like, nothing special. So I only started writing to build an audience for my business, because blogging and building an email list was like a way to get people interested in the content and the products. And then once I started doing that, I was like, wow, I actually kind of enjoy this. Like, what I really liked was not the writing. The writing was always effortful, but what I loved was the feedback. I loved writing ideas, sharing them with people, and then hearing, this is really helpful. I have a very funny story now. At the time, I was like kind of frustrated by it, but I applied to the University of Chicago Medical School, and I was declined from their medical school. And then that same week, the dean of their school sent me an email that said, hey, we really love your work. We've been using it to train our staff. And so I was like, all right, maybe I should focus on the writing and on sharing these ideas.
That's a great story.
They seem to be making an impact in the medical field anyway. Anyway, so to cut to the chase on the New York Times thing and how that all happened, I didn't know I loved writing at first, but over time I developed this interest in it. When I started Medskl.com, I did know that I liked writing, but I did not know that I wanted to write a book. So I wrote 2 articles a week for the next 3 years, built an audience, ended up being about 200,000 people after 2 or 3 years. I leveraged that audience to get introduced to literary agents and publishers. And that was when I started thinking seriously about, okay, I've been writing a couple hundred articles now, maybe I should do a book. That led to me meeting my agent, signing on with her, writing a book proposal. That took 3 months. Book proposal got done. We submitted it to 19 publishers. We got meetings with 7. I flew to New York for a week. We met with all of them. Thankfully, we were fortunate, and we had multiple offers from different publishers. We ended up selecting Penguin. I went with them, signed on for the book deal, and I did not know what I was getting myself into. I signed the deal and originally agreed to write the book in 1 year. I got about a year in, felt very lonely, depressed, tired, writing constantly, feeling like I was, banging my head against the wall. Is this worth it? Perfectionism spiraled out of control. Felt like I had to write the definitive book on habits and human behavior. Otherwise, this would be a total waste. Went to my publisher and said, I'm going to need another year. Like, I need more time to research and write. Very kindly and graciously, they gave it to me. I signed on for a second year, did more of the same, felt very lonely, didn't have much feedback, blew that deadline. And then eventually, finally, 3 months after that, so 2 years and 3 months after signing the deal, I handed in the finished manuscript. That was 9 months ago. We spent the last 9 months prepping for the marketing plan and the launch. I did 80 interviews in 8 weeks, talked to everybody I could try to find to share the book with, flew to New York, did a segment on CBS, national television, launch week, sharing all of that. Basically just working constantly on the marketing of the book. Somehow, incredibly, it all came together at the end and worked. All the interviews are released. Top 10 book on Amazon, top 10 book on Audible. A week later, hit the New York Times bestseller list. So
how does it feel?
It feels great.
Yeah,
it feels great.
That's validation for sure.
Yeah, this is true not just for my story, but it's true. The suffering is what makes it worth it. Like that's the height of the joy is linked to the depth of the suffering. It's like sometimes I think about what if you were a soccer player and you had spent all your life training for soccer, and then you ended up not making it as a professional, but some NFL team picked you up to play football and be a field goal kicker. And you get picked up like 2 weeks into the playoffs and you play like 1 or 2 games and you kick the game-winning field goal in the Super Bowl. It'd be crazy. It'd be a really cool experience, but you haven't spent your whole life training to win the Super Bowl. So it would probably be awesome, but I don't know that it would mean as much to the person on the team who has trained for 20 years and everything has been organized to get onto that team and win a championship. And so nobody wants the suffering. I do it too. We all look for shortcuts. We all look for faster ways to achieve the results we want. But in a sense, it's the sacrifice that makes the victory worth it.
James, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk. The book for everyone out there is Atomic Habits. It's now a New York Times bestseller. I've been following James for quite a while now, and I think his work is absolutely outstanding. So it's definitely required reading next to Cecil's Essentials and a lot of other medical textbooks. So James, once again, it's been a thrill and pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it was great to talk to you.
And for everyone out there, we're also working on potentially getting Robin Cook to do an interview with us. There's lots of other physicians who are going to be joining us in the coming weeks. If you like the show, definitely subscribe. Please also take the time to write in questions in advance for our guests. Thanks very much.